Thank you again for joining us for tonight's session entitled Networking Putinism. Thank you again for joining us, Networking Putinism, the rhetoric of power in the digital age. Our leader for this session is Michael S. Gorham, NHC Fellow 2023-2024 and Professor of Russian at the University of Florida. Michael Gorham is Professor of Russian Studies at the University of Florida and a recent R.T.K. Davis Fellow at the National Humanities Center. He received his PhD in Slavic Studies from Stanford University and served for 12 years as Associate Editor of the Russian Review. Gorham is the author of multiple award-winning books on language and politics, including After Newspeak and Speaking in Soviet Tongues, and is currently completing a book on the impact of the internet and social media on Russian political communication called Networking Putinism, the rhetoric of power in the digital age. I'm also joined tonight by Elizabeth Ault and Guy Hill, who are members of our Teacher Advisory Council, who will serve as TAs throughout the evening. Dr. Gorham, thank you for joining us this evening. We sincerely look forward to your talk.
Mike, thank you very much. It's a good delight. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'm grateful to you and Elizabeth, Raven, and Becky, and everybody else who helped make this presentation possible. I'm particularly grateful to folks all across the country who take the time to dial in. I know you're all very busy, and so I will just jump right into it. I want to draw your attention to the image on this opening slide. It's a pretty mundane image, but it's somewhat symbolic of what I'm going to be talking about for a number of reasons. You probably recognize the gentleman in the middle, Vladimir Putin. His distance from the laptop is pretty indicative of his level of suspicion toward new technology in general. He's got a somewhat suspicious, somewhat bemused look on his face. And the fact that the technology itself on the table is Western made is also reflective of the sorts of tensions that the Russian government is facing with regard to this new information sphere. And finally, the woman to his left is one Margarita Simonyan, the director of one of Russia's main state-run propaganda outlets that used to go by the name Russia Today, and now has refined that down to RT, so it's not quite as transparent where the source of this information comes from. If you've ever been in an international hotel back before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, perhaps you were able to view Russia Today in the English language version of it. She's the head of that and charged with producing content not just on the airwaves, but online as well. So I'm going to be looking at a number of issues, all that might be whittled down into 4 questions that you see on the screen now. What role do the media and public language play in legitimizing political authority? What impact have the internet and social media had on political communication? How have authoritarian regimes such as Russia come to grips with these new technologies, designed as they were to promote open and decentralized communication? And finally, how did this process unfold in Russia, where Putin and the Russian language internet, commonly known as Runet, emerged concurrently in the public political arena? The general outline of my talk is, as you see it on the screen, the majority of my time I'll devote to sections 2 and 3. Sections 2 on 2 visions of the way that the Runet would function in a new digital age in Russia. One more reformist in the form of Dmitry Medvedev, the other more revolutionary in the imagination of Alexei Navalny. And then I'll talk about the government's response to what turned out to be a more revolutionary emergence of the internet as the main mouthpiece for the oppositional movement in Russia. If I have time at the end, I'll add some comments on what what trends we've seen since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and offer some closing thoughts. I'll pause a couple of times to field questions, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Different cultures have different attitudes toward language and public debate in their political arenas. And in Russia, the dynamic is quite different than that which we've had in the United States. If you go back to old Russian didactic literature, the emphasis was more on humility, and verbal confrontation was discouraged in the official realm as well as the unofficial realm. When political institutions were first forming in the 18th century, a dynamic quickly emerged where those with true authority, those in power, in Russian the word for authority and power, and the authorities is all bundled into the one term vlast that you see in parentheses here. Those with authority basically were charged with acting and saw their duties in terms of their actions, and saw very little need to actually speak. It helps if you're in a monarchy when there's one person in power, and everybody else had the right to talk, but their remarks weren't necessarily all that powerful. That dynamic we see emerge in the Soviet political culture in the 20th century, where in the official communicative sphere you had plenty of speeches and lots of long-winded articles pronouncing the party line, but these were all views, opinions, and policies that were carefully hashed out behind closed doors in advance. So public language was pretty much rote rehashing of decisions that have been already made by people in power. There was plenty of opportunity to speak your mind around the kitchen table in private apartments, and that was a common practice among the Russian intelligentsia and the Soviet intelligentsia. But there was a tendency to speak your mind and everybody go home having the same opinions they had when the night started. So that attitude is reflected in Vladimir Putin's approach to public debate and public discourse. As you see in this quote from a journalist and commentator from 2017, Putin kills discussion not by accepting the mere concept of it. Putin kills discussion by not accepting the mere concept of it. When there is no debate, it is impossible to lose a debate. Putin never exchanges views with anybody, he informs. So the main speech act here is informing. It's a one-directional, I have the information, I have the opinions, and you are the listeners, and you will enact what I say. That's indicative in the presidential debates that have happened ever since Putin was first elected president. I think there have been 4 or 5 now election cycles since he's been president, and in each one he had opponents, some self-selected, and in each of those campaigns there were presidential debates aired live on television, but in each one of them there was one key person missing, that is the president, the current sitting president, Vladimir Putin. This happened as well with Dmitry Medvedev for the one term that he served as president. And the argument was, we're too busy being president and fulfilling the duties of the president to take time out to go onto this evening talk show and kind of lower ourselves down to the level of these other mere politicians. And so the debate culture really hasn't been developed in Russia for a good long time. Of course, it helps if you have the bulk of the mass media, the traditional mass media on your side, broadcasting your actions on a daily basis, dutifully based on talking points that have been delivered to main television studios and news broadcasting agencies by the presidential administration. That was a setup essentially that Putin put into place very soon after he came into power in 2000. He got rid of most of independent television, and very soon pretty much all main channels were controlled by the state, if not the state itself, by oligarchs who are friendly to the state. This dynamic changed dramatically with the emergence of the internet in the late 90s and early 2000s. The internet by design is a decentralized mode of communication. It's an opportunity, as one critic has put it, for the privatization of civic activity. You can get your opinions out with a quick tapping on a keyboard from the comfort of your home in a manner where you can get that opinion out to people all over the country, if not the world, creating what another commenter, another scholar called a networked public sphere. So with the emergence of the Russian language internet, or the Runet, suddenly you have a medium where people were engaged in open and public debate, very eagerly so. The early adopters of the Russian language internet all happened to be pretty well educated. That tended to be the case. If you had a computer in the 1990s in Russia, it means you had a decent income and a decent salary. The intelligentsia were all dialed in online, and a fair number of the members of the ruling elite were also there. So although it was a relatively small portion of the population that was online, it was a critical mass of the movers and the shakers and decision makers. And so the early vestiges of the Russian language internet, here you see some decidedly Web 1.0 texts that I don't expect you to be able to read, examples of the sort of content that people were eating up in the late 90s and early 2000s. The left is an image of one of the first online newspapers that published a variety of different opinions. And the right is a screenshot of a social media platform by the name of LiveJournal. It actually had its start in the United States. But if in the United States, LiveJournal was notoriously used by young teenage girls to publish their diary entries and share their inner thoughts, the Russian language version of LiveJournal very quickly became a hotbed for open political debate and discussion. And so even though a lot of the voices of the political opposition in the early 2000s weren't allowed access to the mainstream media, especially television, they were free to express their opinions, and those opinions were read and viewed in the online world. Now, in 2008, Vladimir Putin faced the end of his second presidential term, and by the Russian constitution wasn't allowed to serve a third term. So he essentially tapped his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, to occupy his seat in the Kremlin, and then Putin took the seat as the head of the government, as the prime minister. They essentially switched spots, but Medvedev, unlike Putin, was a real advocate of new technology. He was a geek from the get-go. In the late 90s, he was on proto-social media platforms tapping away, and was the proud acquirer of every new gadget that came out, and made a special trip to Silicon Valley to meet with all the bigwigs there. In the image on the right, you see him tapping out recording one of his first video blogs as president of the Russian Federation. And he made it quite one of his prime policies or initiatives to make the Russian government, bring the Russian government into the 21st century, and really coax bureaucrats who up until that point had no interest in this medium for the most part to establish a presence online. He argued that the world is so open that no politician can hide. We're simply obligated to synchronize our watches with the people, with civil society, and first and foremost on such sensitive issues as the level of civic freedom. So he couched his talk about the internet in terms of civil society and civic freedom, and talked about the internet as being a medium for bringing the people closer to the bureaucracy, closer to the government. He talked about what he called direct internet democracy and said that the internet was a vehicle for producing that. And he basically coaxed his fellow bureaucrats, especially regional governors, to establish a presence online. Authorities, again the word Vlast, must seek out supporters on the net in order to be up to date and relevant. If they do not have such supporters, then it's most likely that a breach will form between authorities and a significant portion of the people. As you might be able to guess, there was something of a generational divide. Some of the young, more tech-savvy governors eagerly embraced these new technologies and were pretty good at blogging and engaging with their constituents. Others, the majority, in fact, were more of the ilk of the gentleman on the left here, Governor of Nizhegorодskaya Oblast, who were somewhat befuddled by this new technology, wondering what the point was and why they had to bother engaging in sort of debate and back and forth with people who their main task was to serve and to dictate to. So it was an uphill battle for Medvedev to establish more of a engaged bureaucracy on the internet. And he himself was an avid active user of social media. And when Twitter came out in 2007, 2008, I believe, in Russia, he was one of the first adopters of that platform. And although it did help him provide something of a more human profile for himself and gave people insights into his ideas, it also had a more problematic side where a lot of his posts seemed a little bit forced, such as this one where he's sitting watching a movie at somebody's home studio with his buddy Vladimir Putin in a very awkward position that I, to this day, can't imagine sitting in while I'm watching a movie, obviously staged. And a lot of his tweets were a bit forced in this regard. Some of them were tone deaf as well. He would put out tweets about being at a Pink Floyd concert, just as nationalist thugs were beating immigrants on the plaza outside of Red Square. So there were incidents like that didn't come over too well. So it was a tough road to hoe for Medvedev. And to add insult to injury, at the end of his first term, Vladimir Putin, who was by many people's view still essentially calling many of the shots, decided he was done being prime minister, and for this next presidential election, he would throw his name into the ring. And so you had in the fall of 2021 a public decision that they would again switch places. Putin would return to the Kremlin, and Medvedev would take over the prime minister's chair as well, essentially putting an end to any vision of bringing the Russian government into the 21st century, because Putin, as I mentioned before, was a bit of a Luddite when it came to new technology. He saw it as a CIA invention. He was close, but not exactly. I think it's the U.S. government who invented it, but in any case, he saw it as being controlled by the West, full of pornography and of no use to anybody. So there was great suspicion on that part. All the while, the alternative voices that I spoke about earlier were becoming more and more pronounced on the internet. One of the most significant of those voices was that of one Alexei Navalny, who was a lawyer by training, who made a point early on in his political career to focus on exposing government graft and corruption. And he was a very tech-savvy individual who latched onto every new social media platform when it came out, and was very adept at using those platforms for a few purposes: sharing information that wasn't otherwise publicized in the mainstream media, for influencing public opinion just by virtue of the way he wrote and the sorts of language that he used on his posts and the following that he built on his social media platforms, and for actually organizing, for taking opinions and plans that were hatched in the virtual world and making them come to life in the real world. He would use LiveJournal as a mechanism for organizing in-person debates. This slide, I realize, is in Russian and you can't read it, but it's essentially an ad for a public debate way back in 2007 between two leading journalists of the time, one of which was a notorious nationalist-oriented guy who was pretty Putin-friendly, and a more liberal journalist. And he and some of his colleagues organized these public debates. They staged them at local bars in Moscow so that people could come and have a beer and listen to open discussions. And they were really quite a lively and raucous events that were staged in 2006 and 2007. Again, an alternative example of how the internet can and did lead to the promotion of open and public civic discourse in the public sphere in Russia. Navalny was also very adept at using the power of the pen, the digital pen in this case, to shape public opinion negatively toward authority and the authorities, and talked a lot again about those key issues of criminality and of corruption. And these were terms that resonated with all Russians. Navalny wasn't sort of a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. He even had somewhat nationalist views himself in his earlier years. But he did recognize that corruption was something that everybody, from the white-collar tech worker in Moscow to the blue-collar cop out in Vladivostok, recognized as one of the biggest evils of the government and had very little patience for. And so that was his main calling card. And so he would blog about it at all opportunities, and would use his LiveJournal blog as a launch pad for pretty serious and detailed investigative journalism that were essentially looking into the mismanagement of funds among the Russian political elite, either big corporate leaders or members of the political class, and would post them on the internet on his LiveJournal platform, which had amassed thousands and thousands of followers and information that would get shared. And it would use that multimedia sort of platform to put up images and videos and post documents, essentially making almost a court-like case in his LiveJournal feed that in a normal democratic country could be brought in court, but with the courts rigged as they were in Russia, didn't really get an open hearing. But the evidence was there, and he made a point of doing that. He talked about the elite in terms of being crooks and thieves, and he created some useful tools. In fact, this was a site called Rospil, dedicated to reporting incidents of Russian state embezzlement of state funds. The pilits is to saw in Russian, but it's colloquial for skimming or embezzling. And so he created this site not only to post reports on embezzlement, but also made it interactive so that citizens from all around Russia could actually log on and report incidents of official embezzlement locally as well. In the winter of 2011, he latched on to a nickname that he created for the United Russia Party, which is Putin's Putin's party, the party of power, calling them the party of crooks and thieves, Partia Жуликов и Воров. And this was a nickname that caught fire immediately as soon as he launched it and became one of the more viral memes of the election season of 2011 and 2012. It would appear on posters on the internet, labeling the United Russia Party as the party of crooks and thieves. Their symbol was the bear over a map of Russia. And it got to be so viral that even members of other parties, here a member of the Communist Party, used it in their campaign slogans for local offices. This is a guy who was running for the Moscow government, in a billboard in which he promises to clean Moscow up of the crooks and the thieves. The party of crooks and thieves made it onto bumper stickers, the backs of cars, and it got to be significant enough that even someone like Vladimir Putin, who, as you recall, made a point of not addressing his opponents whatsoever and avoiding them at all costs, had to address this problem in December of 2011 by essentially saying, yes, they say the party of power is a party linked to thievery and corruption. If you remember the Soviet years, who was in power then? They were all called thieves and corruptionists too. And in the 90s, same thing. It's the stamp of not a concrete political force. It's the stamp of power. His attempt at dismissing this very catchy term as something that we in power all have to put up with. It's the price that we pay for being in positions of responsibility. But he did recognize that it had done significant damage to the reputation of the United Russia Party, to the point where he himself, Putin, distanced himself from United Russia, and he created a completely new movement during the summer of 2011. This is a half a year before presidential elections were coming up. He created this body called the All Russian People's Front as a party of sorts. It was more of a movement, but something that he could latch his name onto that didn't have the tainted, soured reputation of the United Russia Party. The fall of 2011, if you recall, was when he officially announced that he'd be returning to the Kremlin, and this was a period when the Duma elections were in December of 2011, and again, internet web-based technology allowed members of the opposition to, for the first time, document all the variety of ways that the party of power was rigging the elections. They would bring cameras into the election, the voting stations, and actually capture on camera how people were stuffing piles of filled out ballots into the ballot urns. They would capture on video buses of employees from various factories being taken from one election post to another, essentially voting a number of times. This collection of blatant election fraud and the disillusionment among the Russian opposition and generally, I would say, a large portion of the urban educated class led to massive demonstrations in Moscow, the likes of which hadn't been seen really since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the early 1990s. And this was a real serious wake-up call for the Putin regime. He suddenly realized that the very people whose lives he had made comfortable enough that they had enough income to buy computers and to log on to the internet and engage were the very ones who were turning against him in massive numbers, not just in Moscow, but all over Russia. They were organizing thanks to web-based technology. They were sharing information about where the where the demonstrations were going to be located, the time that people would be gathering. Of course, none of this information was made possible in the mainstream media. They posted sites where you could publish, you could print out signs to bring to the rallies. Essentially, this entire movement and protest movement was made possible again by internet technology. So at this pretty serious turning point, it's from this time on that the Putin administration started taking a very serious look at the internet and devising ways to counter this threat that they were facing. At this point, let me pause in my comments and open up the floor to whatever questions that we may have at this point.
All right, good deal, and thank you. And okay, I saw a question, a procedural question in the chat just now, but I encourage you all. I see that the audience chat is moving pretty quickly, and I'm keeping up with it there. But if you should have any questions along the way, please do not hesitate to drop them in the managed Q&A, and I'll bring them to Dr. Gorham's attention at the appropriate time. At this point, there are a few procedural questions, and I'll respond to those in the by text on my end, and I'll address them. But for now, again, everyone, drop your question in the chat. We're going to move ahead. So we should be all set for now, Michael.
Okay, on we go then. So if you look at the ways that the Russian state responded to this web-based threat staged by the political opposition and Navalny in particular, you can bundle the strategies that they adopted into four basic groups. The first two of which I may talk about a little bit in greater detail than the second two, and that is through legislation and regulation, through what I call verbal disruption, by trying to fight fire with fire, and through the building of a more robust electronic government. It should be noted that at this turning point in 2012, when Putin was reelected, and he was reelected by a landslide, his popularity didn't take much of a hit during this demonstration season. He was still widely admired by a majority of the Russian population, and had the elections controlled to such a degree that no serious contenders were even led onto the ballots. So there was never any doubt that he would get reelected. But from this point on, his language started to change a lot. And he was, if Medvedev was all about civic freedom and civic engagement, Putin talked more about civic responsibility once he came back to power in 2012. And if civic might have been a buzzword in the Medvedev terms, for Putin it was all about the need to be civilized. And he talked in this quote, for instance, about civilized democratic procedures, and talked about Russian as a civilization as well, which gives you a sense as to his turn toward painting Russia as a safe haven for traditional values. This is really when that orientation that we see to this day, in fact, really kicked in. But looking at the sort of forms of legislation, we had literally a dozen or so laws come into effect between 2010 and 2022, all somehow relating to regulating either the internet or speech on the internet or access to the internet, regulating where data can be stored, how much power or authority or ownership foreign companies can have, what they're obligated to do. And I will talk about some of these laws in detail. If there's a law that you have a question about that I don't talk about, feel free throw it into the chat. One of the earliest laws that came out was innocuously called Federal Law 436 on the protection of children from information harmful to their health and development. And who could be against a law like that? Everybody wants to protect kids from bad stuff on the internet, from child pornography and drug trafficking and instructions on how to commit suicide. And that's exactly how this law was framed. And that's how it was defended by its co-authors in the parliament, who accused anybody who was protesting against the law of themselves being part of what she called, this is Elena Mizulina, the pedophile lobby. The problem was, and of course we have these debates in Western countries as well. It's a very vital debate going on now about anxiety and among youth and the role of smartphones. And it's a legitimate question. The problem is that in the Russian context, the targets that would be the victims of this law, oftentimes, if not the bulk of the time, would end up being not real bad guys who were trafficking drugs, but rather members of the opposition, members of non-governmental organizations relating to human rights, members of voting rights organizations who were the sorts of folks who were videotaping in the voting precincts. And so the law was written in a vague enough way so that it could be applied basically to target the political enemies of those in power. Another key word that was invoked during this time was the notion of extremism and terrorism. This was another law that was co-sponsored by this Duma deputy, a guy named Lugovoy, who was a former FSB agent who was better known for being the one who put a nerve agent in the tea of a former Russian agent who had defected to London, a guy named Litvinenko, and ended up assassinating him essentially. For his efforts, he was awarded a position in the State Duma. Essentially, his justification for this law on extremism was in order to protect folks from content on the internet that would cause mass unrest and acts of extremism and terrorism and acts of religious and national hatred. And when asked, because again the law was very vaguely worded, how we were to understand the notion of extremism, his basic argument came down to the notion of decency, which is kind of ironic for a guy who feeds people polonium tea. In a decent society under decent authority, the concept of extremism, terrorism, mass unrest, inciting national hatred are always understood as they should be understood. In other words, we'll apply the law as we see fit. You'll have to trust us as decent members of your government. A third buzzword that became particularly salient starting in 2014 with the incidents in Crimea, the Russian annexation of Crimea, and the first incursion into eastern Ukraine, the notion of sovereignty became a big deal. And this was premised on the idea that Russia is surrounded by enemies. The Russian internet is itself extremely vulnerable to foreign influences, especially given the fact that the technology itself was created by a foreign country and its spy agencies. And so the need to protect Russian sovereignty was built into legislation that essentially allowed Russian security agencies to build in even more technology than they already had that controlled the flow of information and enabled them to ban specific sites and entire swaths of the internet whenever the threat whenever a threat appeared, and they didn't need a judge's permission to do that. They could do this extrajudicially, again in the name of protecting sovereignty. Again, the problem here was that the websites that ended up being some of the first victims of this law ended up being websites that were essentially influential newspapers, online newspapers and magazines of the political opposition. Navalny's group and his social media platforms were labeled extremist as well and were banned in Russia. What's also the case is that under the guise of protecting Russian sovereignty, it was really also a means of protecting the sovereign himself. One, Vladimir Putin, there was a law that forbade the defamation of Russian national symbols that came out around 2017, I believe it was. And one of the Russian national symbols that the law applied to was the presidency itself. And so here you have sovereignty and sovereign being protected. And although the main focus was against external threats, they can shut us off from the internet at any moment, and we need to be prepared for that. It's really internal threats that they were also concerned about. So that's the first strategy, the legislation and regulation strategy. The second strategy, what I call verbal disruption, is a different strategy, and it basically involves contaminating that digital public sphere to such an extent that it no longer becomes a viable space for the exchange of open and frank opinion. And the perhaps best online activity that exemplifies that is the act of trolling. And this was a strategy adopted very early on against the political opposition. We have proof in the form of hacked email accounts from members of the pro-Kremlin youth organization Nashi, where its leaders are talking about the fact that every opposition member must be under constant pressure from endless trolling on all social networks to constant spam of his personal mobile with requests to call back or transfer money. It's from the leader of Nashi. In a PowerPoint slide for people who are being trained as Nashi trolls, one of the points read, in the network of commentators, we will increase the number of those commenting, hang out to dry those of our enemies who are conducting targeted work against us and Putin, and troll them, creating a climate in the comment section that force publications to close comment services as such. So it's important to note here that like many of the strategies used today, the goal is not to persuade the other side of one's position or one's political opinion, but rather to basically make open and democratic discourse unviable in the unmediated internet space. And this practice became institutionalized in the form of what was called the Internet Research Agency, also known more commonly as the Kremlin Troll Factory, which was an outfit created in 2013-14 or so out in a suburb of Petersburg that essentially hired people off the street. You see in the slide here the exact wording of the ad campaign that was put up in metro stations around the city, that hired people to come in for shifts and basically spend time creating fake social media accounts on various social media platforms and going into the comment sections of leading world newspapers and basically promulgating basic talking points that were given to them on a daily basis, either contaminating the space or just putting out in the form of what's called astroturfing Kremlin-friendly views Ukraine or anti-NATO or American views. It's of course this Internet Research Agency that was so prominently discussed during the aftermath of the 2006 presidential campaign in the United States. So they became pretty adept at trolling and trying to turn debate culture into troll culture. A third strategy, which I call fighting fire, was with fire, is the attempt to create content that is equally as successful and viral, that is more friendly to the political elite and Putin in particular. Whether that came in the form of attractive women promising on election eve to rip it for Putin at the polls, or in the form of more dystopian videos explaining what would happen if Russia were suddenly to lose its leader, Vladimir Putin, and promising that nothing good would come of it. These were efforts that had a varying range of levels of success, most of the time being pretty obviously concocted and artificially created, but in other cases having some degree of traction. There are also some individuals in positions of power who themselves were pretty adept at using social media for creating a Kremlin-friendly brand for themselves online. The leader of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov, who had a fantastic media team, who posted on Instagram, up dozens of posts a day of Ramzan either praying in the mosque or going for bike rides or fighting his MMA partners in the ring, and also pronouncing his views on politics and on Russia and on Islam. Another figure that you see to the right was a guy named Prigozhin. You may remember him from the attempted coup in the summer of 2023. Well, he was a behind-the-scenes guy for much of the time, sort of Putin's dark art fixer for many years. He was the CEO of the Troll Factory, in fact. But when he was also the head of the private military company, Wagner. And when the Wagner fighters were proving to be some of the only competent and successful fighters in Ukraine, when that war broke out in 2022, Prigozhin established a presence on the social media platform Telegram, which at that point had become the most popular platform. And he too had a media team that was quite adept at creating a brand for Wagner, for Prigozhin himself, that usually painted the Russian government in good light until, of course, he took it upon himself to march on the Ministry of Defense, and because he was angry about how they were mistreating him. Later on in the teens, there were initiatives that were extremely well funded within the government to create what they called positive content. And this is basically along the lines of let's just try to put out content that shows happy young faces who are vibrant, doing things, if not for the state, but in initiatives that are sponsored by the state, and being good citizens and doing good things, and content that will inspire people to go out and do good things as well, and think at least positively about the Kremlin, if not support it actively. And this proved to be quite a challenge, although in some cases they made some inroads. We've seen a lot of activity with the younger generation, the grade school generation, sadly, with efforts to create sort of a more patriotic orientation in this time of the war. The final strategy that I'll talk about that the government adopted was basically trying to make the internet and social media more useful for citizens, so that when they thought about the government, they had a positive image of good things that it was doing. And this came in the form of a platform that was called State Services, Gosuslugi. And this is really quite a revolutionary interface that allows citizens of the Russian Federation to basically, it's a one-stop shopping for anything that they might need the state for. If you need a driver's license, this is where you apply for it. If you want a marriage license, same thing. If you want to access your health records, you log on here. If you want to look into your pension, you do the same. If you want to register newborn children that have arrived in your life, this is where you do it. Basically, it's a useful interactive site that allows people to see that the government is doing good with the electronic media in their lives. Of course, the darker side that has emerged since the outbreak of war in Ukraine is this is also where you can get mobilized to become a member of the armed forces in Russia, and you can't argue that you didn't get the mobilization letter because it didn't arrive at your house in the mail if it's sitting in your inbox on the government services site. And of course, there's also the other darker side of electronic government that comes in the form of surveillance, and this is one area that the Russian government has made enormous inroads in over the last 5 or 6 years, largely with the assistance of China, basically inventing the models, everything from street surveillance to surveillance in the metro stops, so that now if you decide to attend an anti-war rally or Navalny's funeral, for instance, when he was buried, authorities don't really need to show up and arrest people in masses on site and create an ugly scene. All they need to do is log on to the video recordings from the local metro and see who was coming in and coming out around the time of that event, and basically pay a visit to people after the fact. So my voice is getting a little raspy here. It must be time for me to stop and field a few more questions, or some questions. And Mike, I'd be happy to have you facilitate that.
Good deal. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have a few questions in the chat. Thank you all for sharing, and thank you all for keeping the audience chat going. It's moving pretty quickly there. First question we have is how is Russia adjusting to AI, and are they incorporating it into their technology usage? Is it just for the ruling class, or do average citizens have access to it? I believe you touched on this. This is a question we had earlier. I want to send this one out to you as well, just in case you wanted to expand on it a little.
That's a great question. I honestly don't have a very educated answer to it. I think, as is the case usually, they're probably working on it hard within their labs and the security agencies, trying to make the best use of it. But it's probably something that, as far as the public sphere goes, they're somewhat behind other countries in the West and China. But that's just an educated guess on my part. It's not something I've looked into in great depth.
No problem. Thank you. And next question: to what extent, if at all, you see Putinist strategies of appropriating and controlling digital media narratives be implied in the U.S., or are crucially different strategies being deployed in the two cases?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Actually, kind of cuts to the chase in some of my closing remarks, so I could jump to that. Basically, I'm not sure that we can thank Putin for some of the for appropriating strategies that he's used. Unfortunately, many of these strategies are being used by countries all across the world, and some of them have easily transferred or manifested themselves in more democratic societies as well as authoritarian societies. We certainly have a problem with aggressive language and trolling type behavior online that has made social media something quite less ideal than the social media that we envisioned when we were talking way back in the early 2000s of a networked public sphere. We don't have Russia to thank for that. I think we can take full credit for the emergence of a lot of negativity and aggression online. Same thing goes for misinformation and disinformation. We've become quite adept at producing that domestically. And I think the dynamic is somewhat different, but there are parallel concerns. There are always reason to question how much information the government has on its citizens. I think it's fair to say in the United States the situation is less pernicious or infectious than it is in Russia in that regard, but we do have major corporations with a huge amount of power that have a lot of information that they're capable of sharing and selling, and they have the ability to determine what we like to see and create algorithms based on that and produce content, not necessarily that's really good for us, but content that will entice us to click again. And so I think there's some parallels, but there are also some differences. And sadly, I think in both cases, there's great cause for concern over the degree to which we're letting these technologies pretty much dampen our capability of both sharing opinion with people whose opinions we don't necessarily agree with, and having any degree of attention span or capability of critically discerning whether the content we're reading is accurate or not.
Good deal. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. We have one more question, and we're going to move on. This question is from Ryan. His question is Putin's strategies, i.e. targeted trolling, fighting fire with fire, etc., are clever, and they work. How can we fight them? How can we combat them? Are there approaches that you've considered to actually address them on our? Yeah.
There are groups, both part of the government and private, who track communication and the flow of information online, and can identify when certain types of posts are traveling around that seem to have emanated from a suspicious source, and in many cases they're able to trace this source back to an account that is created by the Russian security agencies, and make light of that. But again, I think it's a secondary concern to the one of how do we recognize homegrown misinformation and disinformation and trolling, and what are our strategies for dealing with that. In other words, I really don't think that as far as information online goes, Russia is a significant problem now. They would love to think that they're a huge problem, and they'd like to think that they're able to amplify certain opinions and certain statements that speak to the weaknesses of the democratic system, and that's one of their big goals is to prove that democracy is corrupt and it's collapsing. And but the fact of the matter is we're providing plenty of fodder ourselves for people to think that and see that. So I think the strategy is to become more educated and to try to work with our students to be more adept at choosing what content we choose. Choosing what content we wish to consume, and being more discerning about questioning the accuracy of that content.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions that came in while you were responding. We'll go ahead and move ahead, and we'll save some time in the end to respond to those. that works for you.
Sure.
Okay.
Happy to, and I really don't have that much more to say from my end. Other than these trends have been extending through the 2000 teens and into the early 20s, it's worth noting that Navalny and his team continued to operate even under the more constrictive, restrictive environment of these rules on terrorism and extremism. The Anti-Corruption Foundation, his outfit, continued to produce exposés on leading government officials. One of them I had put in the recommended reading list as a YouTube video dedicated to the massive wealth that Dmitry Medvedev has allegedly taken on during his time in government. The 1 hour long video, and quite deftly put together, a combination, if you see it, of hard-nosed investigative reporting, prosecutorial accusations with almost excessive number of documents, but also couched in the sort of humorous language that allows for serious videos like this to actually have any traction among the viewing audience. Navalny himself had a fantastic sense of humor, and he was able to transmit that both in writing and in these videos as well. If you watch it, there are English language captions, and it was this video that gave rise to the next wave of mass protests in 2017. And one of the memes that emerged from his expose of Medvedev came from this video of a large estate that Medvedev supposedly owned on the banks of the Volga River, that had its own private ski slope, that had a number of outbuildings, and had a man-made pond with ripe with a structure in the middle of the pond built for the ducks that resided in the pond. Navalny and his team labeled the house the duck house, and almost immediately the image of the duck and the rubber duck became a meme that broke out of the internet world into the real world of protest culture, so that people who were called out to mass demonstrations in May of 2017 were shown sporting posters bearing ducks and slogans saying that corruption is stealing our future, massive inflatable ducks as well. So 2022, February, fast forward, Putin launches his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And for the most part, this act essentially led to mostly an acceleration of a lot of the reactionary trends that I have outlined in the second half of my presentation. We see a few new laws that are designed to constrain speech online, a law making it illegal to basically reproduce content or information about the war that does not correspond to official declarations by the Ministry of Defense. It was illegal to call the war a war. It needed to be called named by its official term, a special military opposition. It was illegal. It was a criminal offense to degrade the Russian army in any way, shape, or form, which meant any criticism of the war itself. And it also promoted this turbo patriot culture on the social networking platform of Telegram, to the extent where this platform now almost is more pro-Kremlin slanted than oppositional. It's the favorite location of all the main actors now that Facebook and Instagram are not in the picture, and YouTube is as fast being moved out of the scene as well. So in general, I think it's fair to characterize the situation now as one of authoritarianism for sure, but somewhat flexible, or authoritarianism with holes. It's not quite the Chinese Great Firewall that China has. The Russian internet is wired differently, but authorities have the legal, the regulatory, the economic, and the technological means to pretty much clamp down on any individual content provider for sure, and could even shut off access to the internet in regions where there to be outbreaks of protest in some region outside of Moscow. So I'm afraid the prospects for the future are very much tied to the prospects of Vladimir Putin, and nothing's going to get better as long as he is in charge. What happens after he leaves or dies is anyone's guess. Folks who have looked at the waves of attitudes toward public language and debate in Russia do see that there are cycles, and that periods of massive restriction and repression oftentimes are followed by more open, reform-minded periods, such as the glasnost period that we saw under Mikhail Gorbachev. But it may be a while for us to wait around for that. And then the last point is the one that came up in our discussions. I think all the examples you see here from a very authoritarian system, but the internet, even in Western societies that are more democratically oriented, has evolved in a way that gives us pause, or should give us pause, as to how we are using these technologies, whether we're using them to the best of their abilities, or whether they're doing stuff to our communities, to our minds, that don't promote public democratic exchange, but kind of deaden critical thought. And with that happy note, I will call it a day as far as my formal remarks go. But again, I'm happy to entertain questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Truly appreciate you. We have maybe a couple of questions down here. We have a question from Christine. And her question is, to what general extent are students allowed access to digital media / learning apps, et cetera, in Russia during or for school instructional purposes?
That's a great question. I don't know about specific rules as far as schools go, but the internet is still widely accessible. It's what on the internet people have access to, and if a particular social networking platform or site has been put on the blacklist and banned, then students using the regular internet connection provided by service providers or Wi-Fi won't have access to that. Some of the more interesting newspapers and news information sources that actually cover the news from a variety of angles are also blocked. And so Russians have become adept over the past 6 or 7 years at using virtual private networks, or VPNs, to as a workaround to get access to these sites that are blocked off. But the situation in schools is very, very difficult now with this war going on. I'm afraid there's a culture that is promoted that really has ramped up the necessity to display your patriotism. In our schools we say the national anthem usually at the opening bell, but in Russia it's you sing the national anthem, and patriotic songs are a part of the school day on a regular basis. Youth groups have been created to promote patriotism as well. And again, in a normal operating society, there's nothing wrong with promoting patriotism, but this is essentially forced patriotism, and it's patriotism in support of very dubious causes. The most dubious of them is the aggression in Ukraine. So short answer, access is there, but it is limited to stuff that hasn't been banned, or in some cases even to pre-approved what are called white lists in regulatory culture. That is a pre-approved list of OK sites that have been screened in advance.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for that question, Christine. Do you see the Russian control of narratives eventually being overwhelmed as we continually improve ways to spread information? Do you see the Russian control of narratives eventually being overwhelmed as we continually improve ways to spread information? Thank you for that question, Jason.
If I understand the question correctly, our ability is the ability of the United States, and I'm not quite sure our ability to spread information within the Russian internet space is growing, is getting better. I think the Russian government has made it more and more difficult for their citizens to get access to information emanating from the West. We still do have outlets such as the Voice of America and other information agencies that are trying to broadcast into Russia, and people with VPN services can get access to. But I don't know that the narrative is under threat from outside forces. I think the narrative most likely will come under threat if people start to experience in their everyday lives enough keen levels of sacrifice and difficulty that the narratives that they're being fed online and in the mainstream media do not coincide with the reality that they see in their daily lives. It's the battle. It's often phrased in terms of the battle between the television and the refrigerator. Once your refrigerator is limited to very simple items that are hard to get and maybe overpriced, and you don't have the luxury items that you used to have, then those narratives that are being broadcast over television become extremely problematic and hollow. In fact, viewership, even in the past half year or so, of information, news-based information on television has declined dramatically. And I think people are basically very, very tired of the situation and of the war. They're not necessarily expressing that. It's very dangerous to do that. And most people in this country probably wouldn't do it either if it meant being kicked out of university or being thrown into jail. But they're expressing their discontent by not logging on in the first place, and by maybe mouthing the words to those patriotic songs, but not being all that enthused by them.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question from Eric, and this it actually goes to the VPN comments you were making earlier. But the question Eric has, he's asking about hackers out in Russia. Does Russia have or is there evidence of, successful hacking operations? Eric used the term, he says, is there a hacker problem with hackers unblocking blocked content? I wonder if there's any evidence of successful attempts to continually circumvent those restrictions. And what are the consequences if they're found out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Russia has a long storied tradition of having very excellent hackers who are able to hack into Western accounts and also into the accounts of their own citizens. Sometimes those hackers are working in the interests of the state, and sometimes they are working against the interests of the state. Some of the information from this talk actually came from hacked content by folks who were able to hack into accounts by high-ranking politicians. So there is quite a robust culture of hacking. I'm not sure whether content that has been blocked by the main media oversight agency, Roskomnadzor, is easily made open. I think it probably could be, but my suspicion is that it would not be for very long, and it would probably be only in certain regions in Russia, and it would be closed off pretty quickly. What Russia does with hackers is quite interesting. Oftentimes, it will, especially with more, I guess, politically benign hackers, they're bad guys, but they're hacking to make money or to sell bad stuff online. What the FSB will do is say, hey, we see what you're doing. We recognize what you're doing. We could arrest you and we could put you in jail for a good long time. But instead, why don't you just hang tight and be ready? And when we need some work done, we'll give you a call. So they basically enlist them to do some of their dirty work, so that they can use their skills and also create the guise of denial that the government is involved in these activities at all.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. And again, Eric, thanks you for asking that question. All right. One final question. It's actually from Guy Hill, who is our TA this evening, but he's also one of our teacher leaders here in North Carolina. Thank you, Guy, for being here tonight. His question is there anyone, quote unquote, waiting in the wings to continue Putin's style of governing whenever he leaves office? Surely he can't stay in power forever. Does he have an understudy? Is there evidence that there's some?
That's another great question. The answer is, if there's someone waiting in the wings, they're doing it very quietly, because Putin is a very I don't want to use a clinical term, but paranoid does come to mind. And as soon as he gets wind that there's a politician who's gaining in popularity, he would do everything he can to suppress that popularity. Now, it could be that they are in indirect ways kind of grooming a generation of new administrators and bureaucrats, and there are the younger generation, in fact, 2 generations younger than Putin, of very competent administrators and leaders. But I doubt that they are actively and openly being groomed to replace him. The majority of folks who follow the Kremlin carefully, but at this point, pretty much assume that Putin is not going to step down on his own, and he's decided he's there for life. He has a legacy to think about. He's now comparing himself to historical figures, not to other world leaders. You know, his models are Catherine the Great and Ivan the Terrible, not Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so he has no real interest to think about succession. So there may be people, there are obviously people who are more likely to take over than not, but it's a huge guessing game now. But yes, there's no question that he's not a young guy. He's well into his 70s, and he's rumored to have some health issues. So he isn't going to be around forever, no question about that. But who replaces him is as good a chance it'll be somebody as dictatorial and authoritarian as him as there is somebody who comes in who is more reform-minded. Sad to say, it may take a couple of regime changes for anything really significant to happen. But the hope is that at least this war in Ukraine will come to a swift end if he does leave the scene. If it's not over by the end of the 100 days we're promised that it will end in. Yes.
Well, that's our time, everyone. a collective round of virtual applause. I see the thank yous that are streaming through the chat right now. Dr. Gorham, thank you so very much for your time. This presentation, this talk has been incredibly informative. I can't wait to hear more. Can't wait to pick up a copy of your book of the same webinar title. So everyone keep your eyes out for that, and continue to follow all that's happening with Dr. Gorham. He's down at the University of Florida, former NHC fellow who I had a chance to get to know last year, and I consider myself fortunate to have had those talks, but then also to have him here tonight. So again, thank you so much. To everyone who's here, please continue to follow us. As I mentioned earlier, we have several events that are going on right now. You can find all of that information on our main landing page. And then, of course, you have the institutes. Please consider applying or referring the information or passing the information along to some of your friends. Support the humanities education programs. We provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. And we will be back February the 6th for another NHC fellow, former fellow from 2324, Sequoia Maynard, to Pimp a Butterfly, Hip Hop, American Politics, and Cultural Impact. February 6th at 7:00 p.m. The spring season is going to be one that we are going to enjoy. And it was great to again have Michael on tonight to hear him. And again, we look forward to continuing to follow him. So join us back here next week. And don't forget, we have new webinars that have been added in March. So please check out those links as well. And if I can answer any questions or assist you in any way, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, M. Williams at nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Take care and be well. As a point of order, because this question comes up in the chat, once I close the room tonight, there will be a survey that will pop up. Once you complete that survey, you will receive your certificate. Your certificate auto-generates. So when I close the room up, that's when that's going to happen. Again, thank you all. You take care and be safe out there.